The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop in front of the saloon, sending dust billowing into the afternoon air of Lead, South Dakota. And the woman who stepped down wore a dress too fine for travel and eyes too wary for someone with nothing to hide. Juliana Edwards gripped her carpetbag tight as her boots touched the packed earth of this rough mining town in the Black Hills. It was August of 1878, and the summer heat pressed down on her like a physical weight, though she suspected the perspiration on her brow had more to do with fear than temperature. She had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Philadelphia, leaving behind everything she had ever known, everyone who had ever called her by name. Most importantly, she had left behind the wanted posters that bore her face and the charges that would see her hanged. The town of Lead sprawled before her in all its chaotic glory. Wooden buildings lined the main street, some freshly built and still smelling of pine sap, others already weathered gray by the harsh Dakota winters. Men streamed in and out of the homestake mine like ants from a hill, their faces blackened with gold or dust, their eyes bright with the fever that brought thousands west. Juliana had chosen this place precisely because it was new, wild, and far enough from civilization that questions were rarely asked. She made her way to the only boarding house in town, a two-story structure run by a stern-faced widow named Mrs. Crowley. The woman looked Juliana up and down with an expression that suggested she had seen her share of women running from something, and after a brief negotiation, Juliana secured a small room on the second floor. It overlooked the street, which made her nervous, but beggars could not be choosers, and a woman alone in a mining town had precious few options. That first night, Juliana lay awake listening to the sounds of Lead. Piano music drifted from the saloons, punctuated by laughter and the occasional gunshot. Men shouted to each other in half a dozen languages. Somewhere a dog barked incessantly. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the rapid beat of her heart, and wondered if she would ever feel safe again. The next morning she set about finding work. Mrs. Crowley needed help with the boarding house, but the pay was barely enough to cover her room. Juliana walked the length of Main Street, inquiring at the general store, the millinery, even the newspaper office. Everywhere she went, men stared at her with undisguised interest and women with suspicion. A young, unmarried woman of 23 with no family and no explanation for her presence was an oddity that invited speculation. It was at the general store that she first saw him. Matthew Lawson stood at the counter, his broad-brimmed hat pushed back on his head, discussing an order of supplies with the proprietor. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with shoulders that spoke of hard physical labor and sun-bronzed skin that told of years spent outdoors. His hair was dark brown, slightly too long, curling at his collar. When he turned and his eyes met hers, Juliana felt something shift in her chest. His eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds, and they held a directness that was both unsettling and strangely comforting. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Sir," Juliana replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her stomach. The storekeeper, a rotund man named Henderson, gestured between them. "Matthew Lawson, this is Miss Edwards. She is new to Lead." "Miss Edwards, Matthew runs cattle in the hills south of town. Supplies beef to the mining camps." Matthew extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Juliana took it. His grip was firm, his palm calloused, and the handshake lasted perhaps a second longer than was strictly proper. "Welcome to Lead, Miss Edwards," Matthew said. "I hope you find it to your liking." "Thank you, Mr. Lawson." He collected his supplies and left, but Juliana found herself thinking about him as she walked back to the boarding house. There had been something in his manner, a quietness, a quality of self-possession that was rare in this rowdy town. She shook her head, chastising herself. She had not come 2,000 miles to develop romantic notions about a cowboy. She had come to disappear. But Lade, South Dakota, in the summer of 1878 was not a place where anyone could truly disappear. The town was too small, too interconnected. Within a week, Juliana had secured a position helping Mrs. Crowley and also doing mending and sewing for some of the wealthier mine owners' wives. It was not the life she had imagined for herself back in Philadelphia, but it was honest work and, more importantly, it was anonymous, or so she thought. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after her arrival, when the federal marshal rode into town. Juliana was hanging laundry in the yard behind the boarding house when she heard Mrs. Crowley call her name. The older woman's face was pinched with concern. "There is a marshal asking questions at the saloon," Mrs. Crowley said without preamble, "showing a sketch of someone. I did not see it clearly, but you might want to make yourself scarce." Juliana's blood turned to ice. She dropped the wet sheet back into the basket and hurried to her room, her mind racing. How had they tracked her here? She had been so careful, had used her real surname but changed her first name from Jane to Juliana, had told no one where she was going. She pressed her back against the door of her room, trying to think. The charges against her were unjust. She had not committed murder, no matter what the Philadelphia police claimed. But Jonathan Whitmore had been the son of one of the city's most powerful industrialists, and when he had been found dead in his study with a letter opener buried in his chest, and when Juliana had been found standing over him with blood on her hands, the conclusion had seemed foregone. Never mind that she had walked in moments after the killing, that she had pulled the letter opener from his chest in a panic, trying to help him. Never mind that Jonathan had been blackmailing her, threatening to reveal that her father had embezzled money from Whitmore's father unless she agreed to marry him. The evidence had been damning, and Juliana had known she would not receive a fair trial, so she had run. Now, standing in her small room in Lade, South Dakota, she faced a terrible choice. She could run again, but where? She could try to hide, but the town was too small. Or she could wait and hope that the marshal's sketch did not resemble her closely enough for anyone to make the connection. The decision was made for her when someone knocked on her door. Juliana's heart leaped into her throat. She opened it to find not a marshal, but Matthew Lawson standing in the hallway, his hat in his hands. "Miss Edwards," he said quietly, "I wonder if I might have a word." Juliana glanced past him, but the hallway was empty. She stepped back, allowing him to enter and close the door. It was highly improper for a man to be in her room, but propriety seemed a small concern compared to the noose. Matthew turned to face her, and his gray eyes were serious. "There is a federal marshal downstairs. He is looking for a woman wanted for murder back in Philadelphia. The sketch he is showing does not look much like you, but I saw him watching you through the window while you were hanging laundry." Juliana's knees went weak and she sat down hard on the edge of her bed. "I did not do it," she whispered. "I know that is what everyone says, but I truly did not kill him." Matthew studied her for a long moment. Then he said, "I believe you." She looked up at him, startled. "You do not even know me." "I know enough," he replied. "I have been watching you these past weeks. You work hard, you keep to yourself. You are kind to Mrs. Crowley even when she is sharp with you. You are not a murderer." Tears pricked Juliana's eyes. "The law does not care about that." "The law is not always right." Matthew moved to the window and glanced out at the street. "The marshal is thorough. He will question everyone in town. Someone will make the connection, even if the sketch is poor. You need to leave Lade." "And go where?" Juliana asked helplessly. "If I run again, I will be running forever." Matthew was quiet for a moment. Then he said, My ranch is about 10 miles south of here, up in the hills. It is remote. No one goes there except me and my hired hand, Tom. You could stay there until the marshal moves on." Juliana stared at him. "Why would you help me? You could be arrested for harboring a fugitive." He turned from the window, and in his eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. "Because everyone deserves a chance to tell their story, and because I think you have been running for long enough." The offer hung in the air between them. Juliana knew she should refuse. Accepting would put Matthew at risk, would bind her to him in a way that was dangerous for them both. But the alternative was the noose, and she found herself nodding. "Thank you," she whispered. Matthew moved quickly. He told Juliana to pack only what she could carry in her carpet bag, to leave everything else as if she planned to return. He went downstairs and made a show of asking Mrs. Crowley if she knew of any ranches looking to hire domestic help, explaining loudly that his hired hand's wife had taken ill, and they needed someone to do cooking and cleaning for a few weeks. Mrs. Crowley, bless her, played along, though her sharp eyes told Juliana she knew exactly what was happening. Within an hour, Juliana was seated beside Matthew on the bench of his wagon, her carpet bag at her feet, as they rolled out of Lead. She did not look back, afraid that if she did, she would see the marshal watching them leave. The road south was rough, barely more than a track through the pine-covered hills. The black hills rose around them, dark green and ancient, and Juliana felt herself relaxing slightly as Lead disappeared behind them. Matthew drove in silence for a time, and Juliana was grateful. She needed time to think, to process what was happening. She had placed her life in the hands of a man she barely knew, and yet somehow she felt safer than she had in months. Finally, as they crested a ridge and the landscape opened up before them, Matthew spoke. "Tell me what happened. In Philadelphia." Juliana took a deep breath. It was a relief, she realized, to finally tell someone the truth. "My father worked as an accountant for Whitmore Industries. He was a good man, but he made a terrible mistake. He embezzled money to pay for my mother's medical care when she was dying. It was not much, perhaps $500, but it was theft nonetheless. After my mother died, my father confessed to me what he had done. He was eaten up with guilt. He planned to repay the money, but before he could, he had a heart attack and died." She paused, remembering the awful moment she had found her father slumped over his desk, the life already gone from his eyes. Matthew did not interrupt, just kept his eyes on the road and let her speak. "Jonathan Whitmore somehow discovered what my father had done. He came to me with the evidence and said he would keep quiet about it, would not dishonor my father's memory if I agreed to marry him. I refused. Jonathan was cruel and entitled, and I would rather have lived in poverty than be his wife. But he persisted, and his persistence grew more aggressive. He started coming to my home uninvited, making veiled threats. I was frightened, but I did not know what to do." "You had no other family?" Matthew asked. "No one. My mother was an only child, and my father's family had disowned him when he married her. They thought she was beneath him socially." Juliana smiled bitterly. "So I was alone. Then, one evening, Jonathan sent me a note asking me to come to his home to discuss the matter. I should not have gone, but I hoped I could reason with him, make him see that I would never marry him and he should let the matter rest. When I arrived, his butler showed me to the study. The door was ajar. I pushed it open and found Jonathan on the floor, a letter opener buried in his chest. I panicked. I pulled it out, thinking perhaps I could help him, but he was already dead. Then I heard footsteps and voices. Jonathan's father was coming. I ran, but not before a maid saw me. By the next morning there were wanted posters with my name and description all over the city." "Who really killed him?" Matthew asked. "I do not know," Juliana admitted. Jonathan had many enemies. He was a gambler and a womanizer. He owed money to dangerous men. It could have been anyone, but I was convenient. I was alone with no one to speak for me, and I had clear motive. The police did not look any further. They rode in silence for a while. Then Matthew said, "That is a heavy burden to carry." "Yes," Juliana agreed softly. "It is." The ranch appeared as they rounded a bend in the trail. It was modest but well maintained, a sturdy log cabin with a stone chimney, a barn, and several corrals. Cattle grazed on the hillsides, sleek and healthy. A man emerged from the barn as they approached, lean and weathered with a gray-streaked beard. This was Tom, Matthew's hired hand. Matthew explained the situation to Tom, who listened without expression and then simply nodded. "She can have the spare room," he said. "Welcome, Miss Edwards." That evening, Juliana cooked dinner for the three of them, grateful to have something to occupy her hands. It was simple fare, beans and bacon and cornbread, but Matthew and Tom ate with appreciation. Afterward, Matthew showed her to the spare room, a small but clean space with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the valley. "You are safe here," he said. "No one will find you." Juliana believed him. She slept that night more soundly than she had in months, lulled by the silence of the hills and the sense, however fragile, of sanctuary. The days that followed took on a rhythm. Juliana cooked and cleaned, mended clothes, and tended to the small vegetable garden behind the cabin. Matthew and Tom worked the cattle, riding out before dawn and returning at dusk, dusty and tired. In the evenings, the three of them would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the black hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Juliana found herself watching Matthew more than she should. She noticed the way his face softened when he smiled, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners. She noticed his kindness to the animals, the patience he showed with a skittish colt, the gentleness in his hands as he tended to a cow with an injured leg. She noticed how he always made sure she had enough firewood, how he fixed the loose hinge on the kitchen door without being asked, how he seemed to anticipate her needs before she voiced them. And she noticed the way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention. There was longing in those gray eyes and something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster. One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival at the ranch, Tom announced he was riding into a small settlement 10 miles west to visit a friend. He would be gone overnight. Matthew and Juliana found themselves alone as the sun sank below the horizon. They sat on the porch in companionable silence for a time. Then Matthew said, "Tell me about your life before Jonathan Whitmore." Juliana considered. It was difficult to remember the person she had been, the hopes she had held. "I wanted to be a teacher," she said. "I attended a small college for women in Philadelphia. I was 2 years into my studies when my mother became ill. I left to care for her, and after she died and then my father passed, there was no money for me to return. I took a position as a governess for a wealthy family, but when the wanted posters went up, I knew I could not stay." "You would have made a fine teacher," Matthew said. "Perhaps," Juliana replied, "but that life is gone now." Matthew was quiet for a moment, then he said, "What if it is not?" She turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" "There is a small town about 40 miles west of here, past the settlements, almost to the Wyoming border. It is called Silver Creek, barely 100 people. They need a teacher. I heard about it when I delivered cattle there last month. No one there would know you. You could have a new life." Juliana's heart leaped, then sank. "And the marshal, he will move on eventually. They always do. The sketch is not a good likeness. If you change your appearance somewhat, use a different name, you could disappear into a place like Silver Creek." "Is that what you want?" Juliana asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For me to leave. Matthew turned to her, and in the fading light his face was serious. No, he said. That is the last thing I want. The air between them seemed to thicken. Juliana found she could not look away from his eyes. Then why suggest it? Because you deserve to live your life, not hide on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. You deserve to teach, to have friends, to have a future. I cannot give you that here. What if I do not want to leave? The words escaped before Juliana could stop them. Matthew drew in a sharp breath. Juliana, he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. I am a rancher. I have little to offer. This land is hard, the winters are brutal, and the life is lonely. You come from a city, from education and culture. You would grow to resent this place, to resent me. You do not know that, Juliana said. Do I not? He stood abruptly and walked to the edge of the porch, his back to her. I have been alone for a long time, Juliana. I came west 5 years ago from Missouri after my parents died of cholera. I had a younger sister, Sarah. She was just 16. I brought her with me, thinking we could make a new life out here. But the first winter was harsh and she took sick. I rode 20 miles in a blizzard to fetch a doctor, but by the time we returned, she was gone. Juliana rose and moved to stand beside him. I am so sorry, Matthew. I swore after that I would not be responsible for anyone else's welfare. It is easier to be alone. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were filled with pain. But then you came, and everything I thought I knew about myself turned out to be a lie, because I am not content to be alone anymore. I think about you every moment of the day. I lie awake at night wondering if you are safe, if you are happy, and it terrifies me. Juliana reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, strong and warm. I am wanted by the law back east, she said softly, echoing the confession she had made that first day in Lead. I have nothing to offer you but trouble and danger. Matthew looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. In his eyes was a tenderness that made her breath catch. Out here, you are only wanted by me, he said. The words hung in the air between them, a declaration and a promise. Juliana felt tears sting her eyes. She had been running for so long, had been so afraid, and here was this man offering her not just shelter but acceptance, not just safety but love. Matthew, she whispered, and then she was in his arms and he was kissing her. It was a kiss of longing and relief, of all the words they had not said and all the feelings they had tried to suppress. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. I am not going anywhere, Juliana said firmly. I am staying here with you for as long as you will have me. Matthew cupped her face in his hands. Forever then, he said. I will have you forever. They stood together on the porch as full darkness fell, wrapped in each other's arms, and for the first time since she had fled Philadelphia, Juliana felt truly at peace. The next morning brought a complication. Tom returned from his overnight trip with troubling news. The federal marshal had been asking questions in the settlements, showing his sketch and offering a reward for information. More concerning, he had specifically asked about anyone new to the area, particularly women traveling alone. He is determined, Tom said as they sat around the breakfast table. Word is he was hired specifically by the Whitmore family and will not give up easily. Matthew's jaw tightened. Then we need a plan. They spent the rest of the morning discussing options. Juliana could not stay at the ranch indefinitely. Eventually, someone would see her, would mention the woman living with Matthew Lawson, and the marshal would come. But if she went to Silver Creek or any other town, she risked being recognized. It was Tom who suggested the solution. Marry her, he said bluntly, looking at Matthew. A married woman takes her husband's name. Miss Juliana Edwards wanted for murder is not the same as Mrs. Juliana Lawson, wife of a respected rancher, and a married woman is less likely to draw attention. Juliana felt her cheeks flush. We cannot marry simply to evade the law. That is not a foundation for a marriage. Matthew reached across the table and took her hand. Is it not? What better foundation than choosing to bind our lives together in the face of adversity? Juliana, I love you. I know it is fast, perhaps too fast, but I have never been more certain of anything. I want you to be my wife, not because it is convenient, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Juliana looked into his eyes and saw only honesty and love. Her heart swelled. I love you too, she said, but I do not want you to feel obligated. I do not, Matthew said firmly. I feel fortunate, so what do you say? Will you marry me? She smiled through her tears. Yes, she said. Yes, I will marry you. They were wed 3 days later by a circuit preacher who rode through the area once a month. Tom stood as witness, and Juliana wore a simple blue dress she had brought from Philadelphia. It was not the wedding she had dreamed of as a girl, with a church full of guests and elaborate celebrations. But standing in the small cabin, speaking vows before God and the man she loved, Juliana felt a joy more profound than she had ever imagined. I, Juliana, take you, Matthew, to be my lawfully wedded husband, she said, her voice clear and steady. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. Matthew's voice was equally steady as he repeated his own vows, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife and Matthew kissed her, Juliana felt as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She was no longer Jane Edwards, fugitive and accused murderess. She was Juliana Lawson, wife and partner and woman loved. That night they lay together in Matthew's room, which was now their room. The window was open, letting in the cool night air and the sounds of the wilderness. Matthew held her close, his hand stroking her hair. Are you frightened? He asked softly. Of what? Juliana replied. The marshal, the future, everything, she considered. No, she said finally. For the first time in a long time I am not frightened, I am hopeful. Matthew kissed the top of her head. I will do everything in my power to keep you safe. I promise you that. I know, Juliana said. But even if the worst happens, even if they find me, I will not regret this. I will not regret you. They made love for the first time that night, tender and passionate, and afterward, Juliana lay in Matthew's arms and felt truly at home. The weeks turned into months. August gave way to September, and the aspens on the hillsides turned gold. Juliana threw herself into life on the ranch. She learned to milk the cow, to churn butter, to preserve vegetables for the winter. She learned to ride, though she would never be as skilled as Matthew, and she came to love the early morning rides through the hills, the mist rising from the valleys, the deer lifting their heads to watch them pass. The marshal eventually left lead, or so they heard through Tom, who made regular trips to town for supplies. But he had left behind a network of informants and a standing offer of reward money. Juliana knew they could never be truly safe as long as the Whitmore family wanted revenge. It was on a cold October afternoon that everything changed. Matthew had ridden out to check on some cattle in the north pasture, and Juliana was in the garden harvesting the last of the squash when she heard horses approaching. She looked up to see 3 riders coming down the trail. Her heart sank when she recognized the federal marshal in the lead. She straightened, forcing herself to remain calm. There was nowhere to run, and even if there were, she would not abandon Matthew. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to meet them. The marshal dismounted, a tall man with a thick mustache and cold eyes. "Mrs. Lawson," he said. "Yes," Juliana replied, her voice steady. "I am Marshal Garrett. I am looking for a woman named Jane Edwards, wanted for murder in Philadelphia." I have reason to believe she may have passed through this area." Juliana met his gaze directly. "I am Juliana Lawson. I have lived here with my husband for several months. I know nothing of this Jane Edwards." Marshall Garrett studied her for a long moment. Then he pulled a folded paper from his pocket and opened it. It was a wanted poster, and the sketch, while not perfect, was close enough that anyone looking closely could see the resemblance. "You look a great deal like her," the marshal said. "Do I?" Juliana kept her voice neutral. "I would not know. Many women have similar features." Before the marshal could respond, the sound of galloping hooves made them all turn. Matthew came riding hard down the trail, Tom close behind him. He must have seen the riders from the pasture. He dismounted in a cloud of dust and strode to Juliana's side, placing himself slightly in front of her. "Can I help you, Marshal?" he said. "Matthew Lawson," the marshal asked. "That is right. I was just asking your wife about a fugitive from Philadelphia, a woman named Jane Edwards." Matthew's expression did not change. "My wife's name is Juliana, and she has been with me since June. If this woman you are looking for passed through the area, we would not know. We do not get many visitors out here." Marshal Garrett's eyes narrowed. "You married in late August, according to the preacher's records." "That is correct," Matthew said calmly. "We courted for several weeks before that." "Convenient timing," the marshal observed. "Not particularly," Matthew replied. "I loved her and wanted to make her my wife." The timing had nothing to do with anything but our feelings for each other. The marshal turned his attention back to Juliana. "Where are you from, Mrs. Lawson?" Juliana felt Matthew tense beside her, but she answered smoothly. "Ohio originally. I came west seeking work and met Matthew in Lead." "Ohio," the marshal repeated. "Not Philadelphia. No, sir. I have never been east of the Mississippi." It was a lie, a bald-faced lie, and Juliana wondered if the marshal could see through it. But she held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to show the fear that churned in her stomach. The marshal was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The reward for Jane Edwards is $500. That is a lot of money. If anyone in this area knows anything, I would encourage them to come forward." "If we hear anything, we will let you know," Matthew said. The marshal remounted his horse. His two companions, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, did the same. "I will be in the area for a few more days," he said. "If you think of anything, you can find me in Lead." They rode away, and Juliana and Matthew stood watching until they disappeared around the bend. Then Juliana's knees buckled, and Matthew caught her, holding her tight. "He knows," she whispered. "He knows it is me." "Maybe," Matthew said, "but he cannot prove it." "You are Juliana Lawson now, and there is nothing in the records to connect you to Jane Edwards. He is fishing, hoping someone will give you up for the reward money." "What if someone does?" "They will not," Matthew said with certainty. "Tom will not speak, and no one else knows you are here. We just need to be careful for a while longer." But Juliana could not shake the sense of dread that settled over her. That night, she dreamed of Philadelphia, of Jonathan Whitmore's dead eyes staring up at her, of the noose tightening around her neck. The next week brought an unexpected visitor. A well-dressed man in his 50s rode up to the ranch, accompanied by a younger man who appeared to be his assistant. He introduced himself as Harrison Kemp, an attorney from Denver. "I represent the Whitmore family," he said as they sat in the cabin's main room. "I am here on a rather delicate matter." Juliana felt her heart sink. This was it then. They had sent a lawyer to negotiate her return, but what Kemp said next shocked her. "Jonathan Whitmore's real killer has been found," he said. "A man named Robert Sullivan, who owed Jonathan a considerable gambling debt. He confessed on his deathbed 2 weeks ago to a priest, who then informed the authorities. The murder weapon was found hidden in Sullivan's room, along with other evidence. The charges against Jane Edwards have been dropped. Juliana stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. Dropped, she repeated. Yes, Kemp said. The Whitmore family wishes to make amends for the suffering they caused. They are prepared to offer compensation and a formal apology. How did you find me? Juliana asked. Kemp smiled slightly. I am very good at my job, Mrs. Lawson. The federal marshal's reports made interesting reading. It was not difficult to put the pieces together. Matthew leaned forward. If the charges are dropped, why are you here? To deliver the news in person, and to offer Mrs. Lawson the opportunity to return to Philadelphia if she wishes. The Whitmore family will see to it that her name is cleared and her reputation restored. Juliana looked at Matthew, then back at Kemp. I do not want to return to Philadelphia, she said. My life is here now. Kemp nodded as if he had expected this answer. Then I will simply need you to sign some documents acknowledging that you have been informed of the developments and waive any claims against the Whitmore family. There is also the matter of a financial settlement. The family is offering $10,000 as compensation for your troubles. $10,000 was an enormous sum. With that money, Juliana and Matthew could expand the ranch, hire more help, build a proper house. It would change their lives, but Juliana hesitated. I do not want their money, she said. I did not ask for any of this. Take it, Matthew said quietly. You earned it by suffering months of fear and exile. It is the least they can do. Kemp spent the rest of the afternoon going through the legal documents. Juliana signed what needed to be signed, and Kemp promised the money would be transferred to a bank in Deadwood within the month. When he left the next morning, Juliana stood on the porch with Matthew and watched him ride away. It is over, she said wonderingly. It is truly over. Matthew wrapped his arms around her from behind. You are free, he said. We both are. The relief was overwhelming. For the first time since that terrible night in Philadelphia, Juliana did not have to look over her shoulder, did not have to fear every stranger's face. She wept in Matthew's arms, great racking sobs of release, and he held her until the storm passed. Winter came to the Black Hills with a vengeance. Snow fell thick and heavy, blanketing the ranch in white. Juliana and Matthew spent long evenings by the fire, planning for the future. With the settlement money, they decided to build a larger house, one with a proper kitchen and multiple bedrooms. They also purchased more cattle and hired 2 additional ranch hands to help with the expanded herd. Juliana found herself content in a way she had never imagined possible. She loved the rhythm of ranch life, the hard work and the quiet satisfactions. She loved waking up beside Matthew, feeling his warmth, knowing she was safe and loved. And as the winter progressed, she began to suspect that she carried a new life within her. She was certain by February. The morning sickness, the tender breasts, the strange cravings all pointed to pregnancy. She told Matthew on a clear, cold evening as they sat by the fire. He stared at her for a moment, then lifted her in his arms and spun her around, whooping with joy. A baby, he said, setting her down gently. We are going to have a baby. Are you happy? Juliana asked, though she could see the answer in his face. Happy does not begin to cover it, Matthew said. He placed his hand on her still flat belly. This is everything I never knew I wanted. The baby was born in late September of 1879, a healthy boy with dark hair and his father's gray eyes. They named him Samuel after Matthew's father. Juliana had never known love could be so fierce, so all-consuming. She spent hours simply watching Samuel sleep, marveling at his tiny fingers, his perfect features. Matthew was a devoted father. He fashioned a cradle from pine and rocked Samuel to sleep when Juliana was exhausted. He paced the floor with the baby during colicky nights, singing old songs from his Missouri childhood. He looked at his son with such tenderness that it brought tears to Juliana's eyes. The new house was completed that winter, a fine two-story structure with glass windows and a stone fireplace. Juliana delighted in arranging their belongings, in making it a home. She planted flowers in the spring and vegetables in a large garden. Tom's wife, a sturdy woman named Martha whom he had finally convinced to move to the ranch, helped with the housework and became Juliana's closest friend. Life fell into a comfortable pattern. The ranch prospered. Matthew's cattle business grew, supplying beef not just to the mining camps but to towns throughout the Black Hills and beyond. They hired more men, built more corrals, expanded their grazing land. The settlement money had given them a foundation, but it was hard work and determination that built their success. Juliana, for her part, did not forget her dream of teaching. When Samuel was 2 years old, she began offering lessons to the children of their ranch hands. It started informally, just reading and basic arithmetic, but word spread, and soon parents from neighboring ranches were bringing their children to learn. Matthew helped her convert one of the outbuildings into a small schoolhouse, and by 1882, Juliana was teaching 15 children ranging in age from 6 to 14. It was a different life from the one she had imagined in Philadelphia, but it was richer, fuller, more meaningful. She was making a difference in these children's lives, giving them skills and knowledge that would serve them well. And she was doing it in a place she loved, surrounded by people she cared about. In the spring of 1883, Juliana discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was more difficult. She was often tired, and the morning sickness lasted well into the 4th month. But Matthew was attentive and worried over her constantly. Martha helped with Samuel and took over some of the teaching when Juliana needed to rest. The baby, a girl they named Catherine Rose, was born in December. She had Juliana's dark eyes and a full head of light brown hair. Samuel, now 4 years old, was fascinated by his little sister and wanted to help with everything. Juliana often found him standing by the cradle, singing to Catherine the same songs Matthew had sung to him. The years passed in a blur of work and joy. Samuel grew tall and strong, already showing signs of becoming a skilled horseman like his father. Catherine was bright and curious, always asking questions, always wanting to know how things worked. In 1886, Juliana gave birth to another son, whom they named Thomas after Tom, who had become not just an employee but a dear friend. The ranch continued to thrive. They now ran over 1,000 head of cattle and employed a dozen men. Matthew had become a respected figure in the territory, known for his fair dealings and the quality of his stock. He sometimes traveled to Denver or Cheyenne for business, but he never stayed away long. His heart was always at the ranch, with Juliana and the children. Juliana's school had grown as well. She now taught 25 children, and she had hired a young woman from Lee to assist her. Some of her former students had gone on to attend universities in the East, and they wrote to her with news of their successes. It filled her with pride to know she had played a part in shaping their futures. One evening in the spring of 1888, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Matthew took Juliana's hand. "Are you happy?" he asked. Juliana turned to him in surprise. "Of course I am happy. Why would you ask?" "I wonder sometimes if you regret not going back to Philadelphia, not reclaiming your old life." Juliana smiled and squeezed his hand. "I do not regret a single moment," she said. "That life was not truly mine. It belonged to someone else, someone I am not anymore. This life, this ranch, you, the children, this is real. This is where I belong. Matthew kissed her gently. "I love you, Juliana Lawson." "And I love you, Matthew Lawson." They sat together as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, and Juliana thought about the journey that had brought her here. She had fled Philadelphia in fear and desperation, a fugitive accused of a crime she did not commit. She had hidden in a rough mining town, had been prepared to run again. But then she had met Matthew, and he had offered her not just shelter but love, not just safety but a future. She remembered that moment on the porch, so many years ago, when she had confessed her secret. "I am wanted by the law back east," she had said, and he had looked at her with those steady gray eyes and replied, "Out here, you are only wanted by me." Those words had changed her life. They had given her the courage to stop running, to start building, to love and be loved in return. Samuel came running around the corner of the house, Catherine close behind him, shrieking with laughter. Thomas toddled after them as fast as his 2-year-old legs could carry him. They were playing some game that made sense only to children, and the sound of their joy was music to Juliana's ears. "Children, settle down," Matthew called, but there was no real rebuke in his voice. He loved seeing them play, loved the noise and chaos they brought. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Juliana and Matthew lay in bed talking about the future. Samuel would be 10 in a few months, old enough to start learning the ranch business in earnest. Catherine wanted to learn to read Latin, of all things, and Juliana was trying to find books that would satisfy her daughter's intellectual curiosity. Thomas was already showing signs of being a handful, fearless and mischievous. "We are blessed," Matthew said softly. "Yes," Juliana agreed. "We are." She thought about all the things that had to go right for them to end up here, if she had not chosen Leeds, South Dakota, as her destination. If Matthew had not been in the general store that day, if he had not believed her innocence, had not offered her refuge, had not fallen in love with her as she had with him. So many chance moments, so many decisions that could have gone differently. But they had not, and now she had this life, this love, this family. The seasons continued their eternal cycle. Springs brought new calves and the hard work of branding. Summers were hot and dry, with long days spent mending fences and moving cattle to fresh grazing. Autumns were golden and beautiful, a brief respite before winter's harsh grip. And winters were a time to huddle close, to tell stories by the fire, to appreciate the warmth of home and family. In 1892, when Samuel was 13, he helped Matthew drive a herd of cattle to market in Cheyenne. It was his first major responsibility, and he took it seriously. He returned home 2 weeks later, tired but proud, and Juliana saw in him the man he was becoming. He had Matthew's height and build, but also his father's quiet strength, his sense of responsibility. Catherine, now 9, had become an accomplished rider and a voracious reader. She had already read every book in Juliana's small library twice and was begging for more. Juliana ordered books from Denver and Chicago, delighting in her daughter's intellectual hunger. She suspected Catherine would one day want to attend university, and she and Matthew had already begun setting aside money for that eventuality. Thomas, at 6, was as wild as ever. He climbed trees, fell off horses, scraped his knees, and kept everyone perpetually worried. But he had a sweetness to him, a gentleness with animals that suggested depths beneath the rambunctious surface. He could spend hours watching the birds, could gentle a skittish calf with patience and soft words. In the summer of 1894, Juliana received a letter that surprised her. It was from a lawyer in Philadelphia, informing her that a distant cousin had passed away and left her a small inheritance. Not much, perhaps $2,000, but it came with something more valuable, a collection of her mother's belongings that had been in storage. The lawyer arranged for the items to be shipped west. When the crates arrived, Juliana opened them with trembling hands. Inside were her mother's china, her needlework, her journals, and a bundle of letters. Juliana spent an evening reading through the letters, tears streaming down her face, reconnecting with the mother she had lost so long ago. Matthew sat beside her, holding her hand, offering silent comfort. Among the belongings was a cameo brooch that had belonged to Juliana's grandmother. She pinned it to her dress and wore it every Sunday, a tangible connection to the family she had lost, a reminder of where she had come from. The years continued to pass. Samuel took over more and more of the ranch operations, showing a natural aptitude for the work. At 18, he was already a skilled cattleman, respected by the ranch hands despite his youth. Catherine, true to Juliana's predictions, expressed a desire to attend college. In 1897, she left for a women's college in Boston, and Juliana felt a bittersweet pride as she watched her daughter board the train east. Catherine promised to write every week, and she kept that promise faithfully. Thomas, now 11, had finally settled down somewhat. He still loved the outdoors, but he had discovered a talent for training horses. He could take a green-broke colt and turn it into a reliable mount with patience and skill. Matthew often joked that Thomas had more affinity with horses than with people, and there was truth to it. The boy was quiet, introspective, happiest when working with the animals. In 1899, Juliana and Matthew celebrated their 21st wedding anniversary. Tom and Martha hosted a party at the ranch, inviting neighbors and friends from miles around. It was a joyous occasion, full of music and laughter and good food. Samuel had brought a young woman named Emily, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, and the way he looked at her reminded Juliana of how Matthew had looked at her all those years ago. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Juliana and Matthew slipped away to their favorite spot on the porch. The moon was full, casting silver light over the valley. 21 years, Matthew said. It seems impossible. It seems like yesterday, Juliana replied. And also like forever. I would do it all again, Matthew said. Every moment, even the hard parts. As would I, Juliana agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, hands intertwined. Juliana thought about the woman she had been when she stepped off that stagecoach in Lead. Frightened, alone, running from a past that threatened to destroy her. And now look at her. She was a wife, a mother, a teacher, a respected member of the community. She had built a life beyond anything she had dreamed possible. Do you ever think about what might have happened if I had not helped you that day? Matthew asked. Sometimes, Juliana admitted. I think the marshal would have arrested me. I would have been taken back to Philadelphia. Perhaps the truth would have come out eventually, but perhaps not. Perhaps I would have been hanged for a crime I did not commit. I am glad I helped you, Matthew said. I am glad you believed me, Juliana replied. You took an enormous risk. You could have lost everything. I gained everything, Matthew corrected. You, the children, this life. What is risk compared to that? They kissed under the moonlight. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something enduring. The new century arrived, bringing with it change and progress. Automobiles began to appear, strange, sputtering contraptions that frightened the horses. Electricity came to Lead and other towns, though the ranch remained reliant on kerosene lamps and firelight. The territory became a state, and there was talk of even greater changes on the horizon. In the spring of 1901, Samuel married Emily in a ceremony at the ranch. It was a beautiful day, warm and clear, and Juliana cried happy tears as she watched her son pledge his life to the woman he loved. Catherine came home from Boston for the wedding, sophisticated and educated, full of stories about her studies. She had another 2 years until graduation and planned to become a journalist, much to Juliana's delight. Thomas, now 15, stood beside his brother as best man, gangly and awkward in his Sunday suit. But when he smiled, Juliana saw the handsome man he would become. That night, after the celebration had ended and the guests had departed, Juliana and Matthew lay in bed talking about grandchildren. "Emily is a fine young woman," Juliana said. "I think she and Samuel will be very happy." "I think so too," Matthew agreed. "And I think we will be grandparents before long." Juliana smiled in the darkness. "I am too young to be a grandmother," Matthew laughed. "You are 46 years old, my love. That is a perfectly reasonable age for grandmotherhood." "Perhaps," Juliana conceded, "but I do not feel old." "You are not old," Matthew said. He pulled her close. "You are as beautiful as the day I met you." It was not true, of course. Juliana's hair had threads of silver, and there were lines around her eyes and mouth. But she felt beautiful when Matthew looked at her, felt young and desired and loved. They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity, and afterward, Juliana lay in Matthew's arms and felt deeply content. The prediction about grandchildren proved accurate. Emily gave birth to a son in March of 1902, and Samuel and Emily named him Matthew, after his grandfather. When Juliana first held the baby, she was overcome with emotion. This tiny person was her grandson, a new generation, proof of the life she and Matthew had built. Catherine graduated from college that same year and took a position with a newspaper in Denver. She visited the ranch often, bringing her sharp wit and modern ideas. She had suitors, but she was in no hurry to marry, preferring to focus on her career. Juliana supported her fully, proud of her daughter's independence and ambition. Thomas, at 16, had grown into a tall, quiet young man who spent more time with horses than people. He was not shy exactly, but reserved, content in his own company. He had no interest in leaving the ranch, no desire for college or the wider world. His life was here, and he was happy. The years flowed past like the creek that ran through their property, steady and sure. More grandchildren arrived, Samuel and Emily eventually having 4 children in total. Catherine married a fellow journalist in 1907, a kind man named David, and they settled in Denver. Thomas married a quiet young woman named Anna in 1910, and they built a house on the northern edge of the ranch property. Matthew's hair went fully gray, then white, but he remained strong and active, still riding out to check the cattle even as he approached 60. Juliana's own hair was now more silver than brown, and her hands had developed the ache of arthritis, making it difficult to do fine needlework. But she still taught, still tended her garden, still ran the household with quiet efficiency. In the summer of 1915, the ranch celebrated its 35th anniversary. It was also the year of Juliana and Matthew's 37th wedding anniversary. The family gathered, all the children and grandchildren, and there was a great feast with music and dancing. Samuel, now 36 and fully in charge of the ranch operations, gave a toast to his parents. "My father taught me everything I know about cattle and horses," he said, raising his glass. "But more importantly, he taught me about integrity, about hard work, about loyalty. And my mother taught me to value education, to treat all people with respect, to never stop learning." Together they built not just a ranch but a legacy. They built a family, a community, a life worth living. To Matthew and Juliana Lawson, everyone raised their glasses and echoed the toast. Juliana looked around at the faces of her children and grandchildren, at the friends and neighbors who had become like family, and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This was what mattered. Not wealth or status or reputation, but love and connection and the bonds that held people together. That evening, as she and Matthew prepared for bed, Juliana paused to look at herself in the mirror. She was 60 years old and she looked it. But when she looked past the physical, she saw a woman who had lived, who had loved, who had overcome adversity and built something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. "What are you thinking about?" Matthew asked, coming to stand behind her. "I am thinking about how far we have come," Juliana said. "About the girl I was, frightened and alone, and the woman I became." Matthew wrapped his arms around her, and they looked at their reflection together. "You were always strong," he said. "I just gave you a safe place to discover that strength." "You gave me everything," Juliana corrected. "You gave me love and trust and a future when I had none. You believed in me when no one else did. Because you were worth believing in," Matthew said simply. They stood together in the lamplight, two people who had weathered storms and celebrated joys, who had raised children and built a life, who had loved each other through it all. The years that followed were quieter. Matthew finally retired from active ranch management, leaving the operation entirely to Samuel, while he contented himself with puttering around the property and playing with his grandchildren. Juliana closed her school in 1918, feeling that at 63 she had earned a rest. But she still tutored individual students who sought her out, unable to fully abandon teaching. They traveled a bit, visiting Catherine in Denver, taking a trip to San Francisco to see the ocean. But they always returned to the ranch, to the Black Hills, to the place that had become home. The modern world was changing rapidly. The Great War raged in Europe, touching even this remote corner of America as young men were called to service. Automobiles were now common, and there was even talk of airplanes. But on the ranch, life maintained its timeless rhythm. In 1923, on a warm summer evening, Matthew and Juliana sat on the porch as they had done thousands of times before. Matthew had been feeling poorly lately, complaining of chest pains, and Juliana had insisted he see the doctor and lead. But Matthew had waved off her concerns, insisting it was just indigestion. They were watching the sun set, the sky painted in brilliant colors, when Matthew suddenly clutched his chest and gasped. Juliana turned to him in alarm, but before she could move, he had collapsed. She screamed for help, and Samuel came running, but they both knew even before the doctor arrived that Matthew was gone. The heart attack had been massive and instant. The doctor said he would not have suffered, that death had come quickly. But that was small comfort to Juliana, who sat beside her husband's body and wept as though her own heart had been ripped from her chest. They buried Matthew on a hill overlooking the ranch, a spot he had always loved. The entire community turned out for the funeral. Men Matthew had done business with, families Juliana had taught, neighbors and friends all came to pay their respects. Samuel delivered the eulogy, his voice breaking as he spoke of his father's integrity, his kindness, his quiet strength. Juliana stood at the graveside, supported by her children, and felt as though a piece of her soul had been buried with Matthew. They had been together for 45 years, and she did not know how to exist without him. The months that followed were the darkest of Juliana's life. She moved through each day mechanically, doing what needed to be done but feeling no joy in it. She slept in the bed she had shared with Matthew and reached for him in the night, only to remember he was gone. She sat on the porch where they had spent so many evenings together and felt his absence like a physical ache. But slowly, with the support of her family and friends, Juliana began to heal. She would never stop missing Matthew, would never stop feeling the hole his death had left in her life. But she also had so much to be grateful for. She had her children, her grandchildren, her memories. She had nearly half a century of love and partnership. She had a life that had meaning and purpose. One evening, about a year after Matthew's death, Juliana climbed the hill to his grave. She sat on the grass beside the headstone and spoke to him, telling him about the grandchildren, about Samuel's successes with the ranch, about Catherine's latest article in the Denver paper, about Thomas's new foal. And as she spoke, she felt Matthew's presence, felt his love surrounding her, and she knew he was at peace. "I will be with you again someday," she said softly. "But not yet. I still have work to do here. I still have people who need me. So you wait for me, Matthew Lawson. And when my time comes, we will be together again." The wind rustled through the grass, and Juliana imagined she could hear Matthew's voice in it, telling her he loved her, telling her to live, to find joy, to make the most of whatever time she had left. And so she did. Juliana lived another 12 years, dying peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1935 at the age of 80. She spent those years surrounded by family, teaching her great-grandchildren to read, tending her garden, writing her memoirs so that future generations would know the story of how she and Matthew had found each other. She never remarried, never wanted to. Her heart had belonged to Matthew Lawson, and it always would. They buried her beside Matthew on the hill overlooking the ranch. The headstone was simple: Juliana Edwards Lawson, 1855–1935, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, teacher. But the legacy she left was anything but simple. She had come west as a fugitive, accused of murder, with nothing but fear and desperation. She had been saved by a cowboy who believed in her innocence and offered her not just shelter but love. Together, they had built a life, a family, a legacy that would endure for generations. The ranch prospered under Samuel's management, and later under his sons. The school Juliana had started became a permanent institution, eventually growing into a proper schoolhouse that served the entire area. Her grandchildren and great-grandchildren spread across the country, but they all knew the story of how their grandmother had fled Philadelphia in 1878 and found redemption and love in the Black Hills of South Dakota. And on summer evenings, when the sun set over the valley and painted the sky in brilliant colors, people said you could sometimes see two figures sitting on the porch of the old ranch house, their hands intertwined, watching the day end together. It was just a story, of course, a romantic notion. But it was a story that captured the truth of what Juliana and Matthew had shared, a love that transcended even death. Because Juliana had confessed that terrible day so long ago, "I am wanted by the law back east," and Matthew had looked at her with those steady gray eyes and replied, "Out here, you are only wanted by me." And in those words, he had given her everything: a future, a home, a love that would last not just a lifetime but for all eternity. Their story became a legend in the Black Hills, told and retold around campfires and dinner tables, a testament to the power of love to heal, to redeem, to transform. It was a story of second chances and new beginnings, of finding hope in the darkest moments and building something beautiful from the ruins of despair. The ranch still stands today, now run by the fifth generation of Lawsons. The original cabin has been preserved as a historical site, and visitors come from around the world to see where Juliana and Matthew made their first home together. The school building has been converted into a museum, displaying Juliana's teaching materials and some of her personal belongings, including the cameo brooch that had belonged to her grandmother. On the hill overlooking the valley, two headstones stand side by side, weathered by more than a century of Dakota weather but still clearly legible. Fresh flowers appear there regularly, placed by descendants who want to honor the couple who started it all. And in the evening light, when the shadows grow long and the air cools, it is easy to imagine two figures sitting together, watching the sunset over the land they loved, eternally bound by a love that conquered fear, overcame injustice, and built a legacy that would endure forever.